Welcome to Guilty Pleasure Stories channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. The snow fell softly outside the window, casting a shimmering glow over the neighborhood. Christmas lights twinkle on rooftops, and the scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air. It was the kind of evening that belonged in a postcard, but for me it held a deeper significance. My son Alexander was coming home after his first year in the army. I busied myself in the kitchen preparing his favorite meal, a hearty roast with all the trimmings. The rhythmic sound of the knife slicing through vegetables was comforting, but underneath the calm, my heart raced. I hadn't seen him in almost a year, and though we had spoken on the phone, it wasn't the same as having him here in the flesh. The clock ticked closer to his arrival. Every sound outside made me freeze anticipation, bubbling in my ch***t. Finally, I heard the crunch of tires on the driveway. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and hurried to the door, flinging it open. Before he even had a chance to knock there, he was standing tall in his uniform, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The boy I had raised was gone. In his place stood a man. His jawline was sharper, his posture straighter, and his eyes held a depth I didn't recognize. But when he smiled that boyish grin I knew so well, I felt my ch***t constrict with emotion. "Mom," he said, his voice warm and familiar as he dropped his bag and pulled me into a hug. His embrace was strong grounding, and I found myself holding on just a little longer than necessary. "Afraid to let go you're home," I whispered, my voice breaking. He chuckled softly. "I told you I would be." We moved inside, the warmth of the house enveloping us as we shed our coats. Alexander looked around, his eyes lingering on the familiar decorations. The same wreath on the door, the stockings hung by the fireplace, the slightly crooked star atop the tree. "You didn't change a thing," he said, a hint of nostalgia in his tone. "Why would I?" I replied, leading him to the dining room. "It's still your home." Dinner was lively. He told stories of his training, his platoon, and the camaraderie he had found among his fellow soldiers. I listened intently, savoring every word. Occasionally his eyes would darken when he spoke about the challenges he had faced, but he always deflected with a joke or a smile. After dinner, we settled in the living room. The fire crackled softly, and the tree lights cast a cozy glow. Alexander seemed more subdued now, his earlier exuberance replaced with a quiet introspection. "Mom," he began, his voice hesitant, "I missed this. I missed you." I felt a lump form in my throat. "I missed you too, sweetheart." "Every single day," he nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. "It's different now, being away, seeing things, it changes you." I wanted to ask what he meant, but I knew better than to press. Instead, I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "No matter what, you'll always have a home here." His lips quirked into a faint smile, and for a moment he looked like the boy I used to tuck in at night, his worries soothed by my presence. As the night wore on, Alexander grew quieter, his eyes occasionally flickering toward me as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I didn't push. Instead, I suggested we call it a night, knowing he needed rest after his long journey. Before he headed upstairs, he paused by the tree, staring at the ornaments. "You kept my handprint ornament," he said, his voice soft. "Of course I did," I replied, walking over to stand beside him. "You made it when you were 6. It's one of my most precious things." He touched the ornament gently, his fingers brushing against the small red handprint encased in clay. "It's funny," he said after a pause, "how some things stay the same, even when everything else changes." I placed a hand on his shoulder, the fabric of his uniform rough beneath my palm. "Some things are meant to stay the same, Alexander, like how much I love you." He turned to me then, hastening, "I love you too, Mom." That night as I in bed, I couldn't help but think about the boy who had left and the man who had returned. There was so much he wasn't saying, so much. I didn't know about his life now, but he was home, and for tonight that was enough. As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in a soft silence, I found myself praying for more moments like this, for laughter around the table, for the sound of his voice filling the house, and for the knowledge that no matter where life took him, he would always find his way back. To me this was Christmas, and he was home, and for the first time in a long while, my heart felt whole. The morning after Alexander's arrival, the house was filled with a comforting hum of activity. I woke early to the faint sounds of him moving about upstairs. His steps heavier than I remembered but still familiar. I brewed coffee, the rich aroma filling the air, and set out breakfast. A simple spread of eggs, toast, and bacon. The kind of meal I used to make when he was in high school before the demands of life started pulling us in separate directions. Alexander came down the stairs wearing sweats and a worn t-shirt that clung to his broad shoulders. He looked relaxed, his face softer, without the sharp angles of the uniform. Seeing him like this back in his element sent a pang of warmth through my ***T morning, Mom. He greeted, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he sat at the kitchen table. Good morning, sweetheart, hungry? I asked, setting a plate in front of him. Starving, he said with a grin. His appetite was as hearty as ever, and I watched as he ate, content to see him so at ease. Over breakfast, we chatted about mundane things, the weather, the neighbors, how quiet the town had become since he left. It was ordinary, unremarkable conversation, but I treasured it. Every word felt like a thread stitching together the time we'd lost. After breakfast, I suggested we take a walk through the nearby woods, a place we used to visit when he was younger. He agreed, and soon we were bundled up against the crisp winter air, boots crunching in the snow. As we made our way along the familiar path, the woods were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of branches. As the wind swept through, we walked in companionable silence for a while before Alexander spoke, his voice carrying a seriousness that made me turn toward him. I didn't think I'd miss this place as much as I did. He admitted, his breath forming small clouds in the air. I didn't realize how much it meant to me until I was gone. I smiled gently, my hand brushing against his arm. Home has a way of staying with you. Even when you're far away, it's part of you. He looked down at me, his eyes searching. You're part of that, Mom. You're everything good about home. The raw honesty in his voice caught me off guard. My cheeks flushed, though the cold could easily have been to blame. I reached up and touched his cheek briefly, the gesture instinctive. You'll always have this, Alexander, no matter what. He placed his hand over mine, holding it there for a moment longer than necessary. His gaze lingered on mine, something unspoken passing between us. I pulled my hand away, gently clearing my throat as I turned back toward the path. That night, we watched another movie in the living room, the glow of the fire casting shadows that danced across the walls. Alexander sat close to me on the couch, the space between us non-existent. As the film played on, I became acutely aware of how his arm brushed against mine when he shifted, how his presence seemed to fill the room in a way that was both comforting and disconcerting. At two points, he reached for the blanket, draped over the back of the couch, and spread it across both our laps. The gesture was casual, but the warmth of the shared space felt intimate, almost too much. I focused on the screen, willing myself to ignore the flutter in my ****T every time he moved. When the credits rolled, neither of us made a move to get up. The fire crackled softly, and the silence between us stretched heavy with the weight of something unspoken. Mom, he said. Finally, his voice quiet but steady. Can I tell you something? Of course, I replied, my heart quickening. He turned to face me, his expression. Ernest, I don't know what I would have done without you this past year. Being away, it made me realize how much you mean to me. You've always been there for me, no matter what. And now that I'm back, I feel like he trailed off, searching for the words. I just feel closer to you, like I can finally see how much you've done for me, how much you've sacrificed. His words stirred something deep within me. I reached for his hand, holding it tightly in mine. Alexander, I love you more than anything in this world. You don't have to thank me for being your mother. It's the greatest privilege of my life. He looked down at our joined hands, his thumb brushing against my knuckles. The simple touch sent a shiver up my spine, and I quickly withdrew, standing up and pretending to tidy the room to mask my unease. It's late, I said, my voice a little too bright. We should get some sleep. Alexander nodded, though his eyes lingered on me as I moved about the room. Good night, Mom, he said, his voice soft. Good night, sweetheart, I replied, avoiding his gaze. The next morning, the atmosphere between us felt different. Charged, we avoided the closeness of the night before, keeping our conversations light and our movements careful. But despite the unspoken tension, I couldn't shake the way my heart quickened whenever he was near. In the afternoon, we decorated the Christmas tree together, a tradition we hadn't shared since he was a teenager. We laughed as we untangled lights and reminisced about old ornaments, the years melting away as we worked side by side. When the tree was finished, Alexander stepped back to admire our work. "It's perfect," he said, turning to me with a smile just like you. The compliment caught me off guard, and I looked away, focusing on adjusting a ribbon. "You're sweet," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "No, I mean it," he insisted, stepping closer. His hand rested on my shoulder, and I felt the warmth of his touch through the fabric of my sweater. "You're amazing, Mom." I turned to face him, and for a moment the world seemed to fade away. It was just us standing in the glow of the Christmas lights, the boundaries between us blurring. His hand slid from my shoulder to my arm, lingering there as his eyes locked onto mine. "Alexander," I said, my voice trembling. I know," he interrupted, his voice steady. "I know this is different, but I can't help how I feel." I froze, my heart pounding as his words hung in the air. I didn't know what to say, how to respond to the intensity of his gaze, the weight of his confession. All I knew was that everything between us had changed and there was no going back. The tension between us lingered long after Alexander's words that night. I carried them with me like a fragile glass ornament, something I dared not examine too closely for fear it might shatter, and yet there was no denying it. His confession had opened a door I couldn't seem to close. In the days that followed, we slipped into an odd rhythm. Alexander stayed close, finding excuses to help around the house or spend time with me. Every shared moment felt charged, like the air just before a thunderstorm. It wasn't overt, but the way his hand brushed mine as he passed the plates at dinner, or the way his gaze lingered when he thought I wasn't looking, it was enough to make my breath catch. One snowy afternoon, we decided to bake cookies together, something we hadn't done since he was a child. The kitchen was warm, the scent of sugar and cinnamon wrapping around us as we worked. Alexander was at the counter rolling dough, his strong hand steady, and sure I couldn't help but watch him marveling at the man he had become. "What?" he asked, catching my gaze and grinning. "Am I doing it wrong?" I shook my head, embarrassed to have been caught staring. "No, you're doing fine, better than fine. Actually." He smirked, a boyish charm lighting up his face. "Well, I had a pretty great teacher." I laughed, brushing flour from my hands. "Flattery will get you nowhere." "Maybe," he said, stepping closer, his voice softening. "But I mean it. You've always been amazing, Mom." The words hit me with a warmth I couldn't explain. He reached up and brushed a strand of hair from my face, his touch lingering just a moment too long. I felt my heart race as his eyes locked onto mine, the intensity in his gaze. "Unmistakable, Alexander." I started, but my voice faltered. "I know," he said, his tone filled with a quiet resolve. "I know this is different, but I can't help how I feel." I turned away, focusing on the cookies as I tried to gather my thoughts. "We shouldn't be having this conversation." "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady but gentle. "We're just talking. There's nothing wrong with that." The air between us grew thick, heavy with unspoken words. I didn't trust myself to answer, so I busied myself with the task at hand, pretending his words hadn't struck a chord deep within me. That night we found ourselves in the living room again, the fire crackling softly as the snow fell outside. Alexander had brought down a bottle of wine, something he claimed a friend had given him as a Christmas gift. "I thought we could celebrate," he said, pouring us each a glass. "What are we celebrating?" I asked, taking a cautious sip. "Being home," he replied simply, his smile warm, "being together." The wine was rich and smooth, and as we drank, the tension between us seemed to ease, replaced by a comfortable warmth. We talked about his time in the army, his hopes for the future, and the memories we shared from his childhood. The more we spoke, the more I felt the years melt away, as though we were just the people enjoying each other's company, free from the constraints of the world outside. As the bottle emptied, Alexander's mood grew quieter, more contemplative. He leaned back on the couch, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I used to dream about this," he admitted, his voice low. "Sitting here with you just like this. It kept me going. When things got hard." I looked at him, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his words. "I missed you too, Alexander." More than I can say, he turned to me, his expression serious. "You're the only thing that's ever really felt like home to me. I don't know what I'd do without you." The room seemed to shrink as his words hung in the air, the firefight casting shadows that danced across his face. He reached for my hand, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through me. "Alexander," I said, my voice trembling. We can't. I know. He interrupted, his voice soft but firm. I know it's not normal, but I can't pretend I don't feel this way. I pulled my hand away, gently standing to create some distance between us. We need to be careful. I said, my heart pounding. This. Whatever this is, it's not right. He stood too, his presence towering yet not intimidating. I'm not asking for anything. Mom, just. I need you to know how I feel. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. The weight of his words pressed against me, leaving me breathless. You should get some rest, I said. Finally, my voice barely above a whisper. It's been a long day. He hesitated, his gaze searching mine before nodding. Good night, Mom, good night. Alexander, I replied, watching as he disappeared up the stairs the following day. We barely spoke, the unspoken tension between us heavier than ever. I threw myself into preparing Christmas dinner, hoping the business would keep my mind occupied. But Alexander stayed close, helping in the kitchen and finding excuses to touch my arm or stand just a little too near. When evening came, we sat down to eat the meal, festive and abundant. We clanked glasses of wine and exchanged small smiles, trying to reclaim the ease we had shared before. Things had grown so complicated, but as the night wore on, I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain, the lines between us blurring with each passing moment. After dinner, we sat by the fire, the glow casting soft shadows over the room. Alexander leaned closer, his arm brushing against mine. Mom, he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made my heart race. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I can't ignore this anymore. I turned to him, my breath catching as I met his gaze. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that made my resolve waver, a longing that mirrored something deep within me. This can't happen, I whispered, even as my heart betrayed me with its pounding. Why not? He asked, his voice steady. Who decides what's right or wrong when it comes to how we feel? I had no answer, only the weight of the moment pressing down on me. And as the fire crackled softly beside us, I realized that whatever boundaries we had tried to maintain had already begun to crumble. The fire crackled softly as we sat on the couch, the warmth from the flames filling the room with a cozy glow. Alexander was close, closer than he needed to be, and though I had told myself to maintain some semblance of distance, I couldn't bring myself to move. His presence was magnetic, drawing me in despite the quiet voice in the back of my mind warning me that this was a line we couldn't afford to cross. We sat in a comfortable silence, the soft hum of Christmas music playing in the background outside. The snow fell steadily, blanketing the world in white. It should have felt peaceful, but the air between us was charged with something unspoken, something that had been building ever since his return. You've outdone yourself this year, Alexander said, gesturing toward the tree. It's perfect. Thank you, I replied, my voice soft, but you're the one who helped me finish it. He smiled, that familiar boyish grin that never failed to make my heart ache with a mixture of love and nostalgia. I think you could have managed just fine without me. I think I'd rather have you here, I said before I could stop myself. His gaze flickered to me, something deeper, passing across his face. I'm glad to be here, Mom. I've missed this, I've missed you. I felt my ****T tighten at the weight of his words. I've missed you too, sweetheart. The warmth of the fire seemed to deepen, or perhaps it was just the way he was looking at me. So intense, so tender. Before I could say anything more, he leaned toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. My breath caught as he placed a gentle ***S on my cheek, his lips lingering just a moment longer than they should have. The room seemed to go, still, the only sound, the crackling of the fire. I turned to face him, my pulse racing, my skin tingling where his lips had been. Alexander, I began, but my voice faltered. I'm sorry, he said quickly, though his voice was calm, not apologetic, in the way I might have expected. I couldn't help it. You shouldn't have done that, I said, though my voice was soft, lacking conviction. I know, he replied. His eyes locked on mine, but it felt right. His words sent a wave of conflicting emotions crashing over me. My heart ached with the intensity of the moment, and yet my mind screamed at me to step away, to remind him of the boundaries that we both knew existed. But I didn't move. Instead, I sat there, my gaze fixed on his, the silence between us, heavy with everything we weren't saying. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as Alexander's K***s replayed. In my mind I touched my cheek, absent the memory of his warmth, lingering like a ghost. It wasn't just the K***s itself. It was the way he had looked at me, the sincerity in his eyes, the way his touch had felt both innocent and charged. At the same time I knew I should feel ashamed, but all I could feel was confusion. What was happening between us, and how had we let it come? This far sleep eluded me, and when the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I gave up entirely. I made my way to the kitchen, hoping the familiarity of routine would ground me. The scent of brewing coffee filled the air, and I focused on the simple task, trying to push the previous night's events from my mind. Couldn't sleep either. His voice startled me, and I turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep, his t-shirt wrinkled. He looked younger like this, vulnerable in a way that made my heart ache. Something like that? I replied, turning back to the coffee pot. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate as though he were testing the waters about last night. Tensed, gripping the counter. We don't need to talk about it, I think we do. He said, his voice steady, because I meant what I said. Alexander, I began, but he cut me off. Let me finish. He said, his tone gentle but firm. I know this is complicated. I know it's not normal, but I can't pretend I don't feel this way. I've spent my whole life looking up to you, depending on you. And now that I'm back, I feel like, don't know, like you're the only person who really understands me. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. I'm your mother, Alexander. This what you're feeling. It's just because we're close. No, he said firmly. It's more than that, and I think you feel it too. His words hung in the air, daring me to deny them. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The truth was I didn't know what I felt anymore. All I knew was that every time he looked at me like that, my resolve wavered. We can't do this, I said finally, my voice trembling. It's not right. Maybe it's not. He admitted, stepping closer, but that doesn't make it any less real. He reached for my hand and I let him take it, his touch warm and steady. I wanted to pull away to break the moment before it could go any further, but I couldn't seem to move. Instead, I stood there, letting him hold me, letting his words sink in. I'm not asking for anything, he said softly. I just need you to know how I feel. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The weight of his confession pressed against me, and I felt tears well up in my eyes. This was too much, too intense, too confusing, too dangerous. And yet a small part of me didn't want to let go. A small part of me wanted to hold on to him, to let the lines blur even further. I need some time, I whispered, finally finding my voice. He nodded, his grip on my hand loosening. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. As he left the kitchen, I sank into a chair, my head in my hands. I didn't know what to do, or how to navigate this impossible situation. All I knew was that everything had changed and there was no going. My story ends here. If you feel that this story is meaningful and brings useful lessons, please like and subscribe to the channel to support me.